In the autumn of 1943, a senior American naval officer stood before a planning conference and made a statement that would later become one of the most uncomfortable predictions in the history of Pacific War planning. He said that the Japanese garrison on Betio Island could be taken in a matter of hours, not days, hours. The island was small enough to walk across in 20 minutes. The naval bombardment being planned would be among the heaviest concentrated on any target in the Pacific to that point. The men who would land were trained, motivated, and equipped with the lessons of Guadalcanal still fresh in their institutional memory. The operation would be difficult, he acknowledged. It would not be easy, but it would be fast. The men in that room who had doubts kept most of them to themselves. This was the culture of the planning process at that stage of the war. The pressure to move quickly, to maintain momentum, to demonstrate that the island-hopping strategy could deliver results on the timeline that Washington and the American public expected, shaped every estimate and every projection in ways that were not always visible in the final plans. Doubt was manageable, schedule was non-negotiable. And so the planners planned, and the estimates were recorded, and the men who would actually land on Betio were told, in the careful language of operational briefings, that the preliminary bombardment would leave little meaningful resistance standing. To understand why anyone believed this, you have to understand what Tarawa Atoll represented in the strategic logic of 1943. The Gilbert Islands, of which Tarawa was the most significant, sat at a geographic crossroads in the Central Pacific that American planners had identified as essential to the next phase of the campaign. Taking the Gilberts would provide airfields and anchorages from which operations against the Marshall Islands could be launched. Taking the Marshalls would open the road to the Marianas. The Marianas would put American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The entire chain of logic was sound, and the urgency behind it was real. Guadalcanal had demonstrated that momentum mattered in the Pacific War. Every month of delay allowed Japan to fortify the next line of defense more thoroughly. Betio was the key to Tarawa, and Tarawa was the key to the Gilberts. The island was tiny, barely 2 miles long and less than half a mile wide at its broadest point. From the air, it looked almost insignificant, a thin strip of coral and sand that barely broke the surface of the Pacific. But it contained something that made its capture essential and its defense formidable. An airstrip. A Japanese airstrip that controlled the surrounding waters and air in a radius that made any advance past it without capture a dangerous gamble. The island had to be taken. The question was only how. What the planners knew about Betio's defenses was extensive and should have produced more caution than it did. Aerial photography and submarine reconnaissance had revealed a fortification system that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. The Japanese commander on Betio, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had been given significant resources and the time to use them. He had constructed a defensive network that covered every approach to the island with overlapping fields of fire. Concrete bunkers with walls 4 feet thick housed artillery pieces, machine guns, and anti-tank weapons. Coconut log barriers and barbed wire ringed the beaches. Mines covered the offshore approaches. Anti-boat guns were positioned to engage landing craft from multiple angles simultaneously. Shibasaki had made a statement to his garrison that was reported in intelligence summaries and should have been understood with complete seriousness. He said that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The statement was bravado, the kind of thing commanders say to inspire their troops, but it was bravado built on a genuine assessment of what he had constructed. The fortifications on Betio were not improvised field positions. They were engineered defensive works built by men who had studied amphibious assault doctrine and designed their defenses specifically to defeat it at every stage, from the water to the beach to the interior of the island. The Marines selected for the assault were the 2nd Marine Division, veterans who had served in the Pacific and been through the grinding months of Guadalcanal. They were not inexperienced troops being sent against a prepared enemy without adequate preparation. They had trained for amphibious assault. They understood the principles of beach landing operations. Their commanders had studied the available intelligence and the plans developed around it. But the plans contained an assumption that would prove catastrophic and that the men on the ground had no ability to correct once the operation began. The assumption was about the tide. Landing on Betio required crossing a reef that extended several hundred yards offshore from the beaches. Intelligence indicated that tides in the area would provide sufficient water depth over the reef to allow landing craft to cross without grounding. The margin was not large. The estimates suggested somewhere between 3 and 5 feet of water over the reef at the planned landing time, but it was considered sufficient for the Higgins boats and the newer amphibious tractors that would carry the first waves of Marines to the beach. Some local experts consulted during planning expressed concern that the tide prediction was optimistic and that certain tidal conditions in the area, known as neap tides, could reduce the water depth over the reef to levels that would strand conventional landing craft. These concerns were noted and weighed against the operational schedule. The Schedule 1. The Marines who boarded their transports in the days before the assault had been told what every soldier and Marine is told before an operation that has been planned by people who are not going to be on the beach. They had been told the plan was sound. They had been told the bombardment would suppress the defenses. They had been told the tides had been calculated. They had been told, in the careful and ultimately meaningless language of operational optimism, that the operation was difficult but achievable, and that the timeline was tight but realistic. Some of them believed it. Some of them, veterans who had learned in the worst possible classroom that plans rarely survive contact with reality, kept their doubts in the same place the planners had kept theirs. Internal, private, managed. On the night of November 19, 1943, the invasion fleet assembled off Tarawa in darkness. The warships that would conduct the preliminary bombardment were in position. The Marines were loaded into their landing craft. The plan was in motion, and the moment when anyone could have changed it had passed. What was coming in the next 76 hours would produce casualties that shocked the American public, generated a political crisis about the conduct of the Pacific War, and force every future amphibious operation to be planned with a humility about what preliminary bombardment could and could not accomplish that the Tarawa planners had not fully possessed. The island that was supposed to fall in hours was about to demonstrate, at an appalling cost, exactly why the man who built its defenses had said what he said. The bombardment began before dawn on November 20, 1943, and it was, by any measurement available to the men watching it, overwhelming. American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened fire on Betio from multiple directions simultaneously. The island disappeared behind walls of smoke and explosions. 3,000 tons of shells fell on a target that was less than 300 acres in total area. The noise was beyond anything that could be described in language calibrated for ordinary experience. Men on the ships conducting the bombardment reported that the concussive force of their own guns was physically painful at close range. The island, from a distance, appeared to be disintegrating. Then the bombardment stopped. There was a pause in the plan, a window during which aircraft would conduct their attack runs before the landing craft moved toward the beach. The pause lasted longer than intended. Coordination between the naval gunfire and the air attack broke down in ways that the planning process had not anticipated. The window during which Japanese defenders had no fire falling on them stretched from minutes into something longer. And in the bunkers and fortified positions that the 3,000 tons of shells had not destroyed, because concrete 4 feet thick does not disintegrate under naval gunfire regardless of the volume, Japanese gunners climbed back to their weapons and waited. The first wave of Marines moved toward the beach in amphibious tractors, the LVTs that could theoretically cross the reef regardless of water depth. These vehicles had their own problems. They were slow, mechanically unreliable, and offered almost no protection to the men inside them. As they crossed the line of departure and headed toward Betio, the Japanese guns that had survived the bombardment, which was most of them, opened fire. The tractors began taking hits. Some stopped. Some burned. Some reached the beach with their occupants alive, and some reached it with their occupants dead, and some never reached it at all. Behind the first wave came the second, and then the third, in Higgins' boats that could not cross the reef. The tide prediction had been wrong. The neap tide conditions that the cautious advisors had warned about had materialized. The water over the reef measured, in the places where men would later take measurements, somewhere between 1 and 3 feet. The Higgins boats grounded on the coral hundreds of yards from the beach. The ramps dropped. The Marines stepped off into water that was in some places knee-deep and in others chest-deep, and in a few places deep enough to drown men carrying full combat equipment. And between the reef and the beach, there was no cover. Nothing. Open water and open sand, and the full weight of Japanese defensive fire that had survived the bombardment and the pause and the approach. The men who crossed that water did so in a way that requires careful description, because the clinical language of military history does not adequately represent what it meant physically and psychologically. They walked, some of them, through chest-deep water, holding their rifles above their heads, watching the men beside them fall and continuing forward, because the options were forward or back, and back meant more open water and more exposure and the same fire from a greater distance. Some were hit entering the water from the boat. Some were hit in the middle of the crossing. Some were hit within yards of the beach. Some reached the beach and were hit there. The Marines who crossed the reef at Tarawa on the morning of November 20th did so under conditions that the planning process had not intended to create, and that no training could fully prepare a human being to endure. The Marines who made it to the beach found a narrow strip of sand between the water and a coconut log barrier that offered the first actual cover available since leaving the reef. Men pressed against this barrier in whatever numbers had survived the crossing, some units nearly intact and others reduced to fractions of their starting strength, and tried to understand what had happened and what needed to happen next. The barrier was not a position from which the island could be taken. It was a temporary refuge from fire that was still coming from every direction. Getting off the beach meant crossing open ground to reach the first line of Japanese fortifications. Staying on the beach meant being killed there by fire or by the tide when it came in. The commanders watching from ships offshore were receiving fragmented and contradictory information about what was happening on the beach. Radio equipment had been lost in the crossing. Officers who would have reported were dead. The smoke and confusion of the bombardment's aftermath made visual observation from offshore nearly meaningless. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner and General Holland Smith, the senior commanders of the operation, understood from what they could see and what fragments of communication were reaching them that something had gone seriously wrong. The scale of what had gone wrong was not yet fully apparent. It would become apparent over the hours that followed as casualty estimates began to accumulate. The individual moments from that morning have been recorded in accounts given by survivors, and they share a quality of compression, the way that extreme circumstances reduce experience to a sequence of immediate physical realities with nothing between them. A Marine describes the man beside him being hit, and the decision to keep moving as not really a decision at all, just the continuation of the only available motion. Another describes reaching the coconut log barrier and finding it occupied by men from 3 different units who had no communication with their officers and no coherent plan for what to do next. Another describes the specific sound of fire coming from multiple directions simultaneously, the way it made it impossible to identify where safety lay, because safety did not exist in any direction. By midday on November 20th, the situation on Betio was one that the planners had not planned for and could not immediately resolve from offshore. Hundreds of Marines were dead or wounded. Units were fragmented and intermixed along a narrow beachhead that had not been expanded as the plan required. The reef was still covered in the bodies of men who had not completed the crossing. Landing craft were still attempting to bring in reinforcements and supplies, and still grounding on the coral and still taking fire. The island that was supposed to fall in hours had not fallen. It had absorbed the first day's assault, and its defenders, behind their 4-foot concrete walls, were still fighting with the full organization and discipline of a garrison that had prepared for exactly this moment. The Marines on the beach were not broken. That is the fact that the situation's description must not obscure. They were in a position that should have broken them, and they were not broken. Small groups of men, sometimes led by officers, and sometimes led by sergeants, and sometimes led by whoever among the survivors, had the combination of presence and urgency that the moment required, began doing what needed to be done. Moving forward, crossing the open ground between the barrier and the first Japanese positions, attacking bunkers with whatever was available, dying in the attempt and being replaced by the next man who moved forward. The battle for Betio had not gone according to plan. It had gone according to something else entirely, something that does not appear in planning documents, but that the Marine Corps had been building for decades. The willingness to continue forward when everything that has happened so far argues against it. There is a specific kind of frustration that combat produces when the weapons available to a soldier do not work against the target in front of him. It is different from ordinary fear and different from the confusion of unexpected circumstances. It is the particular helplessness of applying force correctly and watching it fail, of doing everything that training specified and finding that training did not account for what is actually there. The Marines who survived the reef crossing and reached the beach at Betio encountered this frustration in its most extreme form within hours of landing. The Japanese bunkers that covered the island were not just difficult to attack. Against the weapons that most Marines carried ashore, they were effectively immune. The construction of Betio's defensive works had been a project of careful engineering conducted over months by Japanese military engineers, with access to significant quantities of concrete, steel, and labor. The main bunkers were built to specifications that reflected a genuine understanding of what American naval and air bombardment could deliver. Walls 4 feet thick of reinforced concrete absorbed direct hits from naval shells that would have destroyed any field fortification. Roofs were similarly protected. Firing apertures were positioned to allow weapons inside to cover approach routes, while presenting minimal exposed surface to return fire. The structures were not elegant, but they were effective in the specific way that military engineering aims for, the way that makes an attacker's job not merely difficult, but geometrically costly. The naval bombardment that had preceded the landing had demonstrably failed to destroy these positions. Post-battle surveys of Betio's fortifications found that the majority of the major defensive works had survived the preliminary bombardment structurally intact. The men inside them had been shaken, disoriented, and in some cases deafened by the concussive force of thousands of shells landing nearby. But they were alive. Their weapons were functional. And when the Marines appeared in the water crossing the reef, the garrison of Betio was ready to use those weapons with the full organization and skill that months of preparation had produced. Clearing a concrete bunker in conditions where explosive and artillery support is unavailable or ineffective is one of the most dangerous tactical problems in infantry combat. The approach routes are covered by fire from the bunker itself and often from adjacent positions specifically positioned to protect each other. Getting close enough to attack the structure means crossing ground that the defenders have had months to register with their weapons. Once close, the options are limited. Grenades can be thrown through apertures if the thrower survives long enough to reach throwing distance. Flamethrowers can project fire through openings if the operator can get into position. Demolition charges can be placed against walls or ventilation points if someone carries them there through the fire. Each of these methods requires men to cover distances and perform physical actions under direct fire at ranges where accuracy is not difficult for a prepared defender. The flamethrower became the weapon that Betio's bunkers ultimately could not defeat. The Marines had brought flamethrowers ashore, and the men who carried them understood their tactical importance in a way that the weight and vulnerability of the equipment made grimly concrete. A flamethrower operator carrying his equipment was a conspicuous target. The tanks on his back, if hit by enemy fire, had consequences that required no elaboration to anyone watching. The men who carried flamethrowers toward Japanese bunkers on Betio did so understanding this with complete clarity. Some of them completed the approach and used their weapons. Some of them were killed before they reached their targets. The ones who got through changed the tactical situation in their immediate area in ways that grenades and rifle fire had not been able to accomplish. The individual acts of movement across open ground that the bunker clearing required have been documented in the Medal of Honor citations awarded for Tarawa, which are among the most densely concentrated in any single engagement in Marine Corps history. The citations describe, with the formal language of official recognition actions, that in plainer terms amount to men walking toward prepared positions under fire because the positions had to be cleared and someone had to clear them. Staff Sergeant William Bordelin swam ashore after his craft was sunk, picked up demolition charges, and attacked 4 Japanese positions before being killed. First Lieutenant Alexander Bonneman led an assault over the top of a heavily defended bunker complex and was killed holding the position he had taken. These are not stories of recklessness. They are stories of men who had calculated the tactical situation and determined that the mathematics of the alternative, leaving the positions intact, was worse than the mathematics of attacking them. The physical environment of Betio compounded every tactical problem the bunkers created. The island was small enough that nowhere on it was far from somewhere else, but small did not mean simple. The surface was covered with the debris of the bombardment, shattered coconut palms, wrecked equipment, the wreckage of positions that had been damaged, if not destroyed, the bodies of men from both sides who had not survived the morning. Movement across this surface under fire required a continuous series of small decisions about cover and exposure that exhausted men physically and mentally in ways that added to the cumulative cost of the fighting. Heat on the equatorial island was extreme. Water was scarce. Wounded men lay where they had fallen because the fire made evacuation as costly as the original advance. The Japanese garrison fought with a consistency and discipline that the Marines who survived Tarawa described with a respect that was entirely separated from any other feeling about the enemy. Positions that were clearly surrounded and had no possibility of reinforcement or relief continued to resist until the last occupant was dead or incapable of fighting. The cultural and institutional framework that produced this resistance was different from the American framework in ways that had direct tactical consequences. Surrender was not a considered option for most of the Betio garrison. This meant that each position had to be reduced completely, that no position could be bypassed and left to be dealt with later, and that the cost of clearing the island would be the cost of killing, essentially, its entire garrison. There were approximately 4,500 Japanese defenders on Betio when the landing began. When the island was declared secure 76 hours later, 17 had surrendered. The rest were dead. By the end of the second day, the Marines had made progress that the morning's disaster had made seem impossible. The beachhead had been expanded. The airstrip had been reached and was being crossed. Units that had been fragmented and isolated in the morning were finding each other and establishing coherent lines. The tactical picture was still brutal and the cost was still accumulating, but the direction of the battle had shifted. The Japanese defenders, who had held every advantage on the morning of November 20th, were being reduced position by position, bunker by bunker, at a cost that was appalling and at a pace that was nevertheless inexorable. The Marines had found the methods that worked against Betio's defenses. The methods were not elegant. They were not efficient in any sense that a planner would recognize. They were simply the application of human determination to a problem that had no other solution. The first night on Betio was something that the survivors described in terms that consistently returned to darkness and sound. The darkness was complete in the way that tropical nights without artificial light are complete, without gradation or relief, a blackness that pressed against the eyes and made the distance between a man and the next man in his foxhole functionally infinite. Sound carried differently in that darkness. The jungle sounds of Guadalcanal had been biological, the noise of living things moving through vegetation. Betio had almost no vegetation left after the bombardment. The sounds of the first night were mechanical and human. Weapons being moved. Voices in Japanese that the Marines could not understand, but whose urgency required no translation. The specific silence that precedes organized movement. The Japanese commander on Betio understood that his garrison's only realistic hope of changing the outcome of the battle lay in night action. Daylight had demonstrated what American firepower could do to exposed attackers crossing open ground. The same logic applied in reverse. If Japanese forces could get inside the Marine perimeter in darkness, could reach the positions where the fighting would be at close quarters, and the Americans' advantages in supporting fire would be neutralized by proximity, the outcome might still be reversed. Shibasaki was a professional military officer, and he understood the tactical situation on Betio with clarity. Night attacks were not a desperate gamble. They were the rational response to a tactical problem that daylight engagement had not solved. The Marines waiting in their perimeter positions during the night of November 20th and 21st had been fighting for the better part of a day under conditions that produced a specific kind of exhaustion. Not simply the physical depletion of sustained effort, but the accumulated cognitive load of continuous threat assessment in an environment where every decision about exposure and movement had potentially fatal consequences. Men who had been awake for 30 hours or more, who had crossed the reef under fire and cleared positions through the afternoon, now held their positions in darkness and waited for what they could hear was coming. The banzai attacks that characterized Japanese infantry tactics in the Pacific have been described in ways that sometimes emphasize their emotional or cultural dimensions at the expense of their tactical logic. On Betio, the night attacks were not disorganized charges driven purely by spirit. They were coordinated assaults by trained infantry attempting to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of a defensive perimeter in darkness. What made them terrifying was not irrationality, but the combination of purpose, darkness, and the specific sound of a large number of armed men moving with intent toward a position. Marines who survived these attacks described the moment when the sound of movement resolved into the reality of figures appearing at the edge of visibility as a transition that the body processes before the mind does. The fighting that occurred when the attacks reached the perimeter was the kind of combat that training addresses in general terms and that reality delivers in specific ones. Hand-to-hand fighting in darkness between men who have been awake for 30 hours is not a controlled application of technique. It is fast and ugly and decided by factors that include training and physical condition and the specific geometry of where each man is standing at the moment contact is made. Marines used rifles and bayonets and entrenching tools and whatever else was reachable. The attacks were repelled. They were repelled at cost. And when daylight came and the ground in front of the perimeter was visible again, what was visible confirmed that the night had been as violent as it had sounded. The second day brought a change in the tactical situation that the first day's brutal progress had made possible. Marine units that had established footholds in multiple locations across the island were now in a position to begin coordinating their actions in ways that the fragmentation of the landing's chaos had prevented. The airstrip that crossed the island's width became the axis along which the compression of the remaining Japanese resistance could be organized. Units pushed from the beach toward the far side of the island. Other units pushed along the length of the airstrip. The remaining Japanese positions were being systematically reduced, still at significant cost, still requiring the same methods that had worked the day before, but now with a tactical coherence that the morning of November 20th had not permitted. The psychological dimension of the second and third days has been described by survivors in terms that reveal something about the specific quality of sustained combat under these conditions. The fear that the first day had produced, the acute response to sudden extreme danger, had been replaced by something different. Not the absence of fear, but its transformation into something more manageable and more dangerous. Men who had been afraid in the morning of the first day were operating by the second day in a state that combat veterans describe with various approximations. A narrowing of attention to the immediate task. A suppression of the cognitive processes that would, in any other context, produce paralysis. They were clearing bunkers and crossing open ground not because they had ceased to understand the danger, but because they had reached a point where understanding the danger no longer changed what they did about it. The Japanese resistance on the third day was coming from an enemy that had lost the organizational coherence of the first day's defense. Positions that had been part of an integrated defensive system were now isolated, cut off from communication and mutual support, manned by defenders who understood their situation with the same clarity that had informed Shibasaki's original tactical planning. The resistance these isolated positions offered was not diminished by the hopelessness of their situation. It was, if anything, intensified by it. Men who have no option other than to fight with a consistency that men who have options do not always match. The Marines clearing Betio's final positions on the 22nd and 23rd of November were fighting an enemy that had lost the battle and had not modified its behavior in response to that fact. The 76th hour of the battle came on the morning of November 23rd. The firing had not stopped completely. Scattered resistance, continued in isolated positions, and the island would not be declared secure until later that day. But the character of the fighting had changed in a way that the men on the ground could feel before any official announcement confirmed it. The density of resistance had thinned. The organized, integrated defense that had met them on the reef and the beach was gone. What remained was the ending of something. The completion of a process that had been set in motion 76 hours earlier in darkness off a tiny island that most of the men fighting on it had never heard of 3 months before. The island was taken. The cost of taking it was about to produce a reaction in the United States that no one in the planning process had anticipated, and that would change the way Americans understood what the Pacific War actually was. On December 1st, 1943, 9 days after Betio was declared secure, the United States government did something it had not done before in the course of the war. It released photographs of American dead. Not photographs of wounded men in hospitals or soldiers in combat. Photographs of bodies. Specifically, photographs taken on the beach at Betio, showing American Marines lying where they had fallen, faces visible, the specific stillness of death captured in the flat light of a Pacific morning. The photographs were published in newspapers and magazines across the country, and the reaction they produced revealed something about the gap between the war that the American public had been permitted to understand and the war that was actually being fought. The decision to release the photographs was not made carelessly. It followed a sustained internal debate within the Roosevelt administration and the military about the cost of maintaining a sanitized public presentation of the war's realities. The argument for continued restriction was familiar. Photographs of American dead would damage morale, provide propaganda material to the enemy, and potentially reduce public support for the continuation of the war. The argument for release was different and ultimately prevailed. The American public, the argument went, needed to understand what the Pacific War was costing and what it would continue to cost. Without that understanding, the support required to sustain the campaign through the years of fighting that remained could not be reliably maintained. The photographs were released. The public response was not what the more cautious voices had predicted. There was grief and there was anger, but the anger was not primarily directed at the decision to continue fighting. It was directed at the gap between what the public had been told and what the photographs showed. Tarawa had been described in initial reports as a significant American victory, which it was, and the casualty figures had been released, which they had been. But the abstract fact of casualties and the visual reality of bodies on a beach are processed by human cognition in ways that are not equivalent. And the photographs did what the numbers had not done. They made the cost concrete and immediate and impossible to integrate into the narrative of clean, progressive victory that wartime communication had been constructing. The political pressure that followed the photographs' release reached Congress, where several members raised questions about the planning and execution of the Tarawa operation that the military establishment found uncomfortable. The specific question of whether the casualties were necessary, whether better planning or different tactics or different decisions at the command level could have reduced the cost, was asked in hearings and in the press with a directness that reflected genuine public concern. Some of the questions were militarily naive. Some of them were not. The distinction between the two was not always made clearly in the political debate that followed, but the pressure was real, and it required responses from senior military and civilian officials that added to the institutional reckoning with what Tarawa had revealed. What Tarawa had revealed, beyond the specific tactical failures that contributed to the first day's catastrophe, was the fundamental nature of what the Pacific Island hopping strategy would require. Each fortified island between the Gilbert Islands and Japan would be defended by a garrison that had prepared its defenses with the same thoroughness and the same knowledge of American amphibious tactics that Shibasaki had brought to Betio. Each would require an assault that accepted the cost of crossing defended water and beaches in order to reach and reduce fortifications that preliminary bombardment could damage but not destroy. The timeline of the Pacific campaign, measured in islands, meant that the cost of Tarawa would be paid again and again, in different places and in varying amounts, but along the same essential logic, until Japan's ability to defend those islands was exhausted. The military lessons that Tarawa produced were absorbed with an urgency that the political pressure reinforced. The tide calculation failure that had stranded Higgins' boats on the reef became a case study in the necessity of accurate hydrographic intelligence that shaped every subsequent amphibious planning process. The performance of the amphibious tractors, which had crossed the reef when conventional landing craft could not, drove accelerated production and deployment of LVTs that gave later landings a capability Tarawa's first waves had possessed in inadequate numbers. The failure of preliminary bombardment to destroy concrete fortifications produced a fundamental reassessment of what naval gunfire could and could not accomplish, and how the gap between the two needed to be addressed in planning. The specific tactical methods for reducing fortified positions that the Marines had developed on Betio, the combined use of flamethrowers, demolitions, and infantry working in coordinated teams, became doctrine. The Marine Corps institutionalized what the survivors of Tarawa had learned at maximum cost, so that the men who would land on Roy Namur and Saipan and Tinian and Peleliu and Iwo Jima and Okinawa would have the benefit of that learning without having to rediscover it under fire. The lives that the lessons of Tarawa saved in later operations cannot be counted precisely, but the military historians who have studied the progression of American amphibious capability across the Pacific War agree that the learning curve that Tarawa forced was among the most consequential single inputs to that capability's development. The men who fought at Tarawa and survived carried what they had experienced there in ways that the medical understanding of the time did not adequately address, and that the culture of the era did not always permit to be expressed. Veterans described specific recurring memories. The sound of fire coming from multiple directions on the reef. The weight of water resisting movement while exposure continued. The specific quality of darkness on the first night and what had come out of it. Some of them spoke about these things in the years immediately after the war. Many of them did not speak about them for decades. A few never spoke about them at all. The 76 hours on Betio had produced a category of experience that language approached only partially, and that the men who had shared it recognized in each other without requiring description. The 1,009 Marines and sailors killed at Tarawa in 76 hours represent a number that demands to be held alongside the context that gives it meaning. They died on an island that had to be taken, and that could only be taken the way it was taken, at a cost that the planning process had underestimated, and that the reality of Betio's defenses made unavoidable once the commitment to the operation had been made. They died in a campaign that was necessary to reach a series of subsequent objectives that were each necessary in their own right. The chain of necessity that connects Tarawa to the end of the Pacific War is real, and it is traceable. That does not make the cost smaller. It makes it part of something that extended beyond the 76 hours on Betio in directions that the men dying there could not see and were not asked to evaluate. What they were asked to do was cross a reef under fire and clear an island of concrete bunkers and hold a perimeter against night attacks and keep moving forward when moving forward was the most dangerous available option. They did these things. The island was taken. The lessons were learned. The campaign continued, and on beaches and in bunkers across the Pacific for the next 2 years, the men who came after them benefited from what Tarawa had cost and what the Marines who survived it had taught. The 76 hours ended. The war went on, and the small strip of coral and sand in the Central Pacific where it had happened became, in the vocabulary of the Marine Corps and in the history of the Pacific War, simply Tarawa. A word that needed no explanation for the men who had been there and required only the facts for everyone else.